Something inside so strong, I know that I can make it, though you're doing me wrong, so wrong.
The convening of this leadership summit has the potential to reshape and redefine the environmental movement. The United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice is pleased to sponsor this historic leadership summit.
Number 10, environmental justice mandates that the Earth's resources be used responsibly, equitably, and in the interest of a sustainable planet. This is the initial draft of the principles of environmental justice. When we leave here this week, we will leave the summit with a final set of principles that we will carry back home and institute in all of our communities throughout this country. This is our responsibility. The future of our communities is at stake. Venceremos, we will win. Thank you very much.
The environment belongs to all of God's children. You assert that this evening. America will one day hear you. This I promise you. This one member of Congress means to make sure that the Congress of the United States hears your call.
Never walnut, as we say in Cheyenne country. I'm Gail Small. I'm one of your co-chair people. I'm from Northern Cheyenne country in Montana, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here. Our gathering this morning is to build upon yesterday's strong beginning. Today we hope to begin building a multiracial and multicultural environmental justice movement by discerning, recovering, and seeking ways to act upon our historical and cultural roots with respect to our environment.
I think it's important that whatever we do in the area of environment, we have to attach some action to it. It's not enough to talk about it, right? Yes. When we read Rachel Carson's book, and the farm workers came and told us, you know, the farmer I work for uses DDT, we filed a lawsuit on him. And when we signed those first contracts that covered close to 100,000 farm workers, we said you have to ban DDT. And we won't sign the contract until you do. So we had banned DDT maybe 6 or 7 years before the government did.
We had not planned to have a demonstration, but the delegates came with so many issues that they need to raise with members of the Congress. So at noon today, rather than eating lunch, we're going to march to the Capitol.
We, the indigenous delegates of many Indian nations from throughout this country to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, join our voices as one voice in defense of our sacred Mother Earth. The history of the United States is the history of the destruction and sacrifice of indigenous peoples, lands, cultures, natural resources, and ways of life.
I agree with almost all the language here, and I would like to add in item number 6 the word unemployment at the end of the sentence. Environmental justice affirms the right of all workers to gainful employment without being forced to choose between an unsafe job, good health, and unemployment, because I think that's a real issue.
Okay, thank you.
White, black, urban, rural, poor, working class, the nation is fighting for its life and the Lord's earth as He has created it. For they may dump toxic waste on the poor side of town today, but as sure as the wind blows, as sure as it's one earth, what affects any of us in the morning affects the rest of us by sundown. We'll either live together as brothers and sisters or perish apart as fools. That's why there can be no elite environmental movement. It must be a universal environmental movement.
We know that we have been conspicuously missing from the battles for environmental justice all too often, and we regret that fact sincerely. I believe that this historic conference is a turning point, however, and while we can still say the mea culpas from time to time, this is a charge to all of us to work and look into the future rather than to beat our breasts about the past.
I too believe this event is of historic significance. it will mark a major turning point in the environmental movement. And I can tell you it will change NRDC. I would argue that the people who put it together really had a vision. It is indeed a visionary meeting because it is going to unite a whole new segment of life together in a common fight.
For us, the issues of the environment do not stand alone by themselves. They are not narrowly defined. Our vision of the environment is woven into an overall framework of social, racial, and economic justice. It is deeply rooted in our cultures and our spirituality. It is based in a long tradition and understanding and respect for the natural world. The environment for us is where we live, where we work, and where we play.
Freedom and justice is that promised land that the great man of this nation, Dr. Martin Luther King, told us about. What do we do now? Keep fighting. We should stand together in solidarity. Fighting.
And today, a lot of good things came together. We're leaving here as elders with the message.
This week at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C., a new international movement of indigenous and grassroots peoples was born. It is a multiracial, multicultural convergence of existing local and regional grassroots movements and struggles, which are already underway by people of color, which are actively resisting various forms of environmental genocide against them throughout the world.
Hello everyone, that video you just saw was a clip from the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. Good afternoon to all of our human and non-human relatives. Today we gather to celebrate and build on the 30th anniversary of the first National People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit that happened on October in 1991 in Washington, D.C. And my name is Xavier Barraza. I currently serve as an Environmental and Economic Justice Program Coordinator at the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge, located in southern Tiwa Territory and currently occupied by the Pueblo of Isleta, Mountain View Community, and the South Valley. Today's panel consists of 3 powerful members from our community, each of which were at the summit 30 years ago and helped establish these principles and contributed to the history of the environmental justice movement. So I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Magdalena Avila. Dr. Avila identifies as a public health researcher and campesina. She is the daughter of campesinos from Kettleman City, first generation Chicana Mexican-American in a family of 9. Previously the Associate Professor Emeritus of the Community of Health of Education, or the HES department at UNM. Her research is heavily focused on community-based participatory research around key issues of environmental justice and historical trauma. Next, I'd like to introduce one of the co-coordinators of Los Jardines Institute. Los Jardines Institute works at the intersections of agriculture, literacy, and community. Dr. Sofia Martinez. She's worked on programs, workshops, community events, and hands-on trainings on a variety of issues, from farming to environmental justice to gentrification to cultural and art projects, and lifting up the LJI and helped solidify the membership with the Agricultura Farm Network Co-op that supports farmers in the South Valley with marketing, aggregation, and distribution. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Richard Moore. Black Beret and longtime community organizer here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Also was at the first People of Color Leadership Summit and has helped organize around environmental justice and key environmental issues, not only here locally, but nationally and internationally. I'm super excited to be here with you all. And so without further ado, welcome Sofia, Magdalena, and Richard.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Xavier.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And so as following the EJ principles of speaking for ourselves, right, is can you all introduce yourself with anything that I may have not noted on that you'd like to lift up, including your organization and more importantly, your role at the first National People of Color Leadership Summit on Environmental Justice. And if we can, let's open up with yourself, Dr. Avila.
The only thing that I would add is part of the first Environmental Justice Summit. I went as a Pacific West Coast representative, graduate student, youth-based out of UC Berkeley. And there was so much action going on at that time. And so I was asked to attend and then represent my region, which is what I did.
Thank you. And Sofia, Dr. Martinez?
I actually went doing some media work with the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice at the time. An organization that I work with here in Wagamon was affiliated with the network. So, so that was kind of like my role, doing some media work. As a result of that, I did 2 half-hour radio documentaries that were distributed throughout the U.S. through National Public Radio. So I was really lucky to be able to record a lot of people at the conference and then at another conference later on at the Earth Summit in Brazil. So I felt it was just a privilege to meet all these people and get them down on tape.
Thank you. And Senior Moore, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Xavier. At the first People of Color Summit, I was representing the Southwest Organizing Project. It was a delegation that was there, and I was representing SWAP. And as people also are aware, I was I was coordinator of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. So that was my presence there. And we participated on the planning committee of the first National People of Color Leadership Summit.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm so excited to be here in circle with you all. And what do you believe was the most impactful thing that came out of that first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit?
I think for me, this is Magdalena. One of the things is that it really brought together as a whole social movement, the environmental justice movement, which I see as a civil rights movement of the 1990s. And this summit was strategic in planting that seed. And it gave voice, collective voice, to all these communities that were working so hard, from the Southwest to the Midwest, from the Islander communities. We had representatives from, everywhere back east. And it really brought us together in such a strong way that I think all of us who were there knew it was a very significant landmark moment. To the extent we knew it was going to make an impact, but the way that it just hit at all levels, I mean, multifaceted, multi-level in terms of social change. And I'm talking about grassroots organizing, the policy level, the whole even, administrative level later in the presidential years. But more than anything, it brought us together as one voice. And I do have a very vivid memory of a lot of things, but that's how I'll start it off.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, it was like that also, just to have basically over 1,000 people of color representing almost every single class and gender, whatever, culture, race, and it was on all basically, I mean, it was basically the meeting that launched the environmental justice movement nationally. So to really put all those, I mean, that's what intersectionality is all about. And I think the principles of environmental justice are basically now, as we celebrate 30 years later, basically to me kind of like the seminal document of the environmental justice movement, or the ethics of the movement, that should basically kind of set a context for the way that we you know, kind of interact with each other, respect each other, and work together in order to, you know, create the world that we want to create, right? And I know that Richard was involved in a lot of the organization of that. And so, you know, that in itself was, you know, I remember in the organization of basically the networks that led a lot of the grassroots stuff during that first meeting were pretty much communicating on a daily basis. And I think that's what made it powerful, is that across the country, people were communicating pretty much on a daily basis. And I think that that's what made the movement, or that particular moment, extremely powerful.
And I think just kind of following up on those comments, for total transparency, actually, I did not meet Magdalena here in New Mexico. I mean, I think the point that she made was that that the organization that Magdalena was representing during that time in Kettleman City, California, was an affiliate of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, and so that's where we kind of continued our work together. And I think that's what brings us together, even on this panel. I think one of the exciting pieces for me coming out of the first People of Color Summit was the fact that that there's hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of grassroots environmental and economic justice organizations. And since many of us come out of the social justice movement, the racial justice movement, in some cases, we knew each other. We've worked together in the past, previous to the first People of Color Summit. But just the incredible spirit and inspiration of bringing together over 1,000 people of color, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Native Indigenous people, just being in the same place at the same time, and making history at this time was very, very crucial. So we cried together, we laughed together, we celebrated together, and as we left, and many of the historical documents that came out of there were the same historical documents that many of us operate under today.
And wow. It really was such a historical moment, because if there's one part that I remember about the process is, I might be off on the number, but 17 sticks in my head. Maybe it's because of the 17 principles, but anywhere from 15 to 17 of us, the representatives were pushed in behind a closed door, remember? And then they said, you guys are going in there and we're not letting you out until you come up with something. And so that was facilitated by Governor Anaya, at that time, I guess governor from Nuevo Mexico, and he facilitated it. And let me tell you, it was pulling your hair. It was really just kind of really sacred space in terms of the critical dialogue that went on, because not everyone was in agreement, or somebody, you know, would say, well, no, this has to apply to Native people from Alaska. Well, this has to apply from Chicanos in California, just everything, that intersection from Pacific Islanders. And so it was a very critical thinking process. And you could actually feel the process like elements, facets of pain, because it was so profound. And I mean pain in the sense that you're going deep. This was not light. And I'm not sure how many hours we spent behind closed doors before finally everybody at the summit couldn't wait anymore, and they opened the doors, and you guys remember they came dancing. Everybody had their hands locked together when they came dancing around. So it was celebratory and celebrating it, the whole process. It was so collaborative. That was the beauty. That was the fountain. That was the sacred. Respecting each other while also maybe not agreeing, and then at the end producing this fantastic seminal document of the principles that created. And as educators, some of us who went on further and educated in different ways, grassroots or in whatever way, it really brought forth and planted the seed for a philosophy and an ideology that stands as strong, I think, as other civil rights movements. It was powerful, really powerful.
Well, it was really a paradigm shift for environmentalism, no?
Yes.
Because up to that point, environmentalism was defined by conservationism, preservation, and recreation, and these white men basically that were the symbol of wilderness or whatever, and that's just not the reality. You know what I'm saying? It's indigenous and land-based people really that have learned and historically have a legacy of really being in harmony with Mother Nature. Yet, we were, so I think it was really important because it was not, it was the creation of a movement, but also a real paradigm shift. Is the environment is where we live, work, play, pray, and go to school. It's a holistic concept. It's not something that's out there. So in essence, you have to practice environmental justice every day. It's not something that you do on the weekends or something else. And I think that's real important is that up to the time of the summit, there was not a single, if you did like a literature review, there wasn't a single book, article, or anything with the words environmental racism, environmental injustice, much less environmental justice, no, because that's the goal. We're still living under environmental justice and environmental racism in many areas, right? And so I think that's real important because after that first People of Color Leadership Summit, and today if you do a literature review, there are hundreds of thousands of articles and books, I mean, from every possible field. And I think oftentimes that for me, those principles are the seminal documents of the movement. When you really do a review of that literature, not everybody really does that research to look at what are the roots of this movement, who are whatever. And it's not really about identifying people, because as Magdalena says, to me, this is a true example of what a people's document looks like, because people were contacted before and working on what could be the principles beforehand, during the conference, people at night, and then going to this different committees and whatever, and then what ultimately came out of it. So it's truly a people's movement document.
I think when we look back on it, with the comments that have been made, over 1,000 people participated in the first People of Color Summit. And so based upon that, then it was sisters and brothers from rural communities and from urban cities. And I think that's extremely, extremely important. And yes, it was a People of Color, Native Indigenous Summit. And so I flag that because I think that some people may not realize, but there may have been some criticism laid out, why have all these people of color getting together and Native Indigenous people without white folk being at the table? And so, my comment to that is and still historically is, as people of color, we got some things that we need to discuss. And just like other folks, that in various different meetings. So one of that spirit and inspiration then to me would be, we've attended meetings throughout the last many, many years with organizations, with governments and so on. But just seeing over 1,000 people of color coming together and saying, this is the first time that we've been in a room with this many people where the majority, all of the participants are people of color, where vice versa sometimes as a person of color or whatever, we'd go to meetings and we would be the only person of color in the room. Now there was, lastly to say, and if we remember this, both of you, there was Anglos that necessarily did not participate in the first People of Color Summit, but there was hundreds of them too in another room. If you think back on this, because we were there, and then there was another room where there was others that was there that was watching this activity on the screen. So this was a very transparent activity, And redefining environmentalism and conservationism, I think, is one of the primary steps of one of the accomplishments that took place there.
I think too, when we look at a definition, we have the governmental definition that has all the right words, but none of those words were kind of said by us as we kind of defined that for ourselves, because it's much deeper than those words. And I think at the same time, those are some things that we really need to be careful of when we're dealing basically in a society that has a legacy of colonialism, right? And it's not like it's over with, and the role of language, right? I mean, the words sound good, but the change has been slow in coming. And I think now we're at another very significant historical political movement into where the issue of race can kind of be confronted a little bit more sharply. Yet at the same time, I think, again, there's power energies that are really also controlling the language, and it appears to be okay and equitable and just and all this other things, but in a way, there's movements and there's words that begin to set the context for how we're going to interact with each other, because I think that moment that we're talking about now, 12 years later, when the second People of Color Leadership Conference was held, something had happened. In a lot of, maybe there was a diaspora that would happen in a lot of different ways, but at the same time, I think also there was we began to see a little bit of a co-optation of the movement as well.
Very powerful. What would you lift up about this preamble within the environmental justice principles?
I think that's a good and a very important comment that you're making, and as we open that up, I just want to just repeat one thing that people understand about the principles of environmental justice, and this wasn't a document that was pounded out in a few minutes, and Magdalena touched on that, because we would have open discussions, and then we would break down into smaller working groups, and then the discussions of those smaller working groups would be brought back to the body, and then if people had some challenges or additions that they felt that they needed to add, then that was taken back. And so I just want to say this in terms of the preamble, but no one can claim credit for the first People of Color Summit, Principles of Environmental Justice, because that was truly a document that was drafted, written, and processed through grassroots, bottom-up participation. That's very, very important. I think Magdalena touched on that earlier. The preamble, a lot of times, sometimes, from my opinion, is where people may have some challenges around it. But I want to kind of leave it there. I just wanted to kind of repeat that because those principles, just to say it, came from the people themselves, the grassroots, under the leadership of grassroots organizations that were present at the first People of Color Summit.
Leaving off what you said, Richard, and I'm going to read it just so we can all hear it and the viewer can hear it. This is the preamble of the Principles of Environmental Justice that was written on that day. We, the people of color, gathered together at this multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit to begin to build a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities, do hereby reestablish our spiritual interdependence to the sacredness of our Mother Earth, to respect and celebrate each of our cultures, languages, and beliefs about the natural world and our roles in healing ourselves, to ensure environmental justice, to promote economic alternatives which would contribute to the development of environmentally safe livelihoods, and to secure our political, economic, and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our peoples. we do affirm and adopt these principles of environmental justice.
See, to me, that says it all in terms of the spirit that Magdalena was talking about, Richard, that we've been talking about, because compare that to the language that's going on now. I think that even though we're in this political moment, there are points of more division for us rather than more unity. And I think we, the people of color of the United States, that's what that message is saying. It's not an issue of who's more oppressed or whose history is whatever. It's we, the people, and respect for everything. And I think you can also feel that grassroots and land-based indigenous force that was there pushing that agenda forward, no? Otherwise, I think it would have been different language.
I mean, it brings chills to me. I mean,
Yeah.
to be honest, because it's stated in the preamble exactly where we are in this process.
Es un dolor tan profundo en estas palabras, pero también un orgullo demasiadamente profundo. So when you have pain and the honor of everybody in the creation of these words that aren't false words, they're our truth, truly took a lot of thought to put that forth, and they still stand to this day. They still echo the truth of what's happening out there. And if anything, I think the lens has gotten extended even more so, because if, you know, when we talk about EJ, and what we were doing then is we were totally appropriating and changing the social contracts of the day. This is because they were telling us social contract is the Big Ten decided what was the environment. They decided the priorities in the environment. And we said, no more. You guys aren't going to, you're not speaking for us. No one is speaking for us. You know, as Sofia and Richard said, this is our voice. We're going to speak for ourselves. We are not enabled. We are not disabled. We are empowered in whatever capacity we come to you. That's what that preamble was about. The strength of our voice. And it gives me so much pride to just hear it, because I hear all the voices that spoke so strongly and so loud. It was a crescendo, a loud crescendo about the EJ movement. One of the things that I felt, experienced, and to this day when we talk about the EJ movement, is that each one of us present at the summit, and those who even couldn't come, presented a thread in this daily changing sort of essence of how we saw, how we experience environmental justice. By each of us bringing this book of experiences to this gathering, mine being a campesina, many of us really didn't have a choice when we look at how the world was defined and how we chose our professions. Como una hija de campesina, being sprayed as we were picking cotton, being sprayed as we were picking crops, you know, that, and being out there working with my father and my mom and doing union work, I realized for me, public health was the way and the road that I was going to be addressing this. Now, how does that translate in today? Sometimes I actually worry and I wonder how it's still alive, it's still happening, all of this, even with the vaccines. We saw this play out again with the campesinos, with the poor people in the inner barrios, again, the inequities. How do we get the young people to come around like the dreamers did with the whole immigration issue that came about? So it's, we do have to capture it and keep recapturing it in a way that will captivate, I think, the youth. And one of the things that, since we're talking also about Earth Day, is what I see happening in looking at some of the terminology of youth is this whole eco side. We're killing our environment. We're killing, what are we going to leave the future 7 generations ahead? So I'll stop right there, but it's a thread that we all bring to it. And I think it is a question that we add to the principles, but at the same time, they're not something that can be outdated. They are landmark classic.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of add to that. I think that there was several additional pieces that came out of the first People of Color Summit. I think one of those was the unity that we came in with, and then for sure the unity that we left with in terms of struggle. And so sometimes it would be, well, you think in this community that the problems that you're being challenged with are only in your community. That myth was broken before we got there, but it was reaffirmed. So as people of color and Native Indigenous peoples, the unity in terms of coming out of the first People of Color Summit was crucial. I think the other one that's been flagged is the principles of environmental justice and the bottom-up process that was used in the development of the principles of environmental justice. And then I think the other was, it will never be the same again. And it hasn't been the same again. Now, I think that we have to watch out for co-optation, and that's co-optation across the board. And I say that because what we all need to keep in mind is that it was environmental injustice, and we were talking about environmental racism, and then we heard the comment made earlier that it was also environmental genocide. And so we completely lifted it up and connected the environmental racism with the genocide that was taking place from our people throughout this world. And so those connections were very, very crucial. And then I think the piece around we speak for ourselves, whether people like it or whether people don't like it. It's not just the slogan that we're just giving rhetoric to. That's the way we were operating then, and that's the way we need to operate now, that we will truly speak for ourselves. So I think those were some of the crucial pieces. And then lastly, I just say that we have to watch out because we're living now in some similarities to that we were living then and before, was the potential of us being pitted against each other. I just have to really flag that. So we have to be very, very cautious with that, with where we are today. So you can't talk about environmental racism without talking about systemic racism. And I think that's crucial. And if we want to move forward, and that's to all of us, and to governments or to churches or to other national organizations or whoever, we're talking about digging deep into systemic racism. And so it's not about putting Band-Aids on things. We'll put a little Band-Aid over here and you people of color will be all right. It's not about that. If we want to dig deep into that, and it was said over 500 years, then we need to get down and dirty and dig deep into the question of systemic racism.
Yeah, I think, and again, like, to me, the community and the grassroots they're impacted. They're constantly moving forward and challenging it. And again, looking at some of the things that have come up now, 30 years later, if the mantra was we speak for ourselves, if people, I think there are more consultants and technocrats and folks really maybe speaking in behalf of communities. And that's where we have to really begin to think about that, or even as an organizer, scholar, I read a lot of times a lot of articles written in scholarly journals, whether it's the decolonial theorists or other people really kind of saying, well, the environmental justice movement didn't do this, didn't go deep into racism, didn't go deep into sexism, didn't go deep into all this stuff. And I think, again, it speaks to the fact that it was a grassroots movement. It was definitely intersectional, and there's a responsibility for the intellectual and the scholars and the technocrats and the consultants to also recognize that, that some of our work or some of our whatever comes from that. So we have to be able to give back to the movement, right? Lawyers have finance their own offices and work through environmental justice. And how does that money trickle back to the community? How do we make sure that the community 30 years later hasn't lost the capacity to speak for themselves? And that's a reflection that as organizations, as individual organizers and scholars and activists, whatever we think we are, advocates in EJ, that we need to take that point of reflection, and really kind of, where are we 30 years later, and what am I doing to move this forward? Not just lay a critique on those that created the movement. You know what I'm saying?
One of the things that infuriates me so profoundly, traigo coraje, pero rage, in terms of that internal rage that racism can bring about, is in the civil rights movement. We saw a lot of advancement in our gente. We went and got professions in social work, in public health, in legal. I think was like 6 of Chavez's children became lawyers, or Dolores's children. And you keep finding all of these professions that we entered to make a change. We wanted to make systems change. One of the things that infuriates me, again, is that, and I don't ever lose sight of it, is that the environmental movement that we created, all of us collectively as people of color communities, we impacted, but the white racist system did not maintain its commitments, its obligations, and its responsibilities. And that's where I get really upset when I don't see our future, our children advancing in the professions. How many children, I mean, let's do a breakdown of the demographics. How many are in forestry? How many are in the high-tech, divisions, engineering, of all of these, looking at all these professions that is essential to make, as much as it's essential to have the patrones overseeing the acequias and the importance of the cultura, maintaining that is just as important, that we keep moving forward our community through these opportunities. And that's what I hold organizations such as Valle de Oro to a gold standard. I don't know if they can meet it.
No, I'm honored. I will say that, to be in the presence in this discussion with 2 community-based academics, and when we dig into that, and you hear where Magdalena and Sofia's background, where they came from, and so on, that where they came from is connected to where they are today. And so that's extremely important as we move forward here. So I think that's very, very crucial. And I will say just quickly is that the work and the connectedness. First of all, I think this was very intergenerational. So that has to be said. There was young people there, there was adults there, there was elders there. And they came out of some of the smallest villages and even urban communities. Even saying that to myself, I remember even the Habasupai. I mean, how did they get to Washington, D.C.? They came up on horseback from the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and then on the rim of the canyon, a van picked them up, and then from there they continued to travel. Now I say that because if we're going to deal with the real get down of systemic racism, then even these issues that we're talking about, even the history of governments and so on, government agencies and other entities. So then the strategic plan, the environmental economic justice strategic plan of the refuge has to be, that's been said, rooted in the culture and the histories of what we're talking about. And so lastly, we're going to have some agreements and we're going to have some disagreements, but those agreements are in good faith. And as we continue to build on the work of the refuge, we don't want any of these comments to be left behind. Just like we say, no community should be left behind. and in the development of these processes, whether they're farm worker communities or wherever, then along with our work at BDO, then no person or no community should be left behind.
Oh.
You all touched on already Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge, which we are celebrating, right? Hosting this celebration of 30 years of building on the environmental justice movement, and really carrying out, working to carry out a real true bottom-up process, building and learning from the work that was established so many years ago. Is there anything else you all would like to add or to touch on when it comes to Valle de Oro and this effort of an agency carrying something out that is kind of awkward, right? When it comes to carrying it out, it's not something it's used to. It's not something it knows how to do, which is why it's learning from community. It's learning from folks like yourselves who have done the work, who have done this bottom-up process that you've already expressed takes a lot of work, takes a lot of strife, a lot of back and forth, a lot of communication, deep relationships, walking together on a long journey, not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so is there anything else you'd like to add when it comes to this project here, so close to your homes, right? It's in your backyard, it's in our backyard.
I think if I were, I'm very thankful for this particular Zoom meeting session. You know, we see each other all the time and communicate, but to really sit down and have this type of discussion, because we make time for it, it's really special. To hear our thoughts, our collective, and to give strength to each other, to nurture each other in our thinking, in what we're doing and how we're working. And if I see, you know, como se dice el dicho, cada cabeza es un mundo, well, then I see humanity as an altar. That we're going, you know, either way. If we can really learn, I think, as part of Earth Day, how special the altar is in terms of all the special elements, the sacraments that we bring to it. But ultimately, it's our heart. What's that fire in our heart? What is giving it that passion? What is giving it that light? And how can I pass that light on to that next generation so that they will feel it, so that they will, it's not just a word, it's a meaning. Those of us here and those of us who went to that conferencia, the summit, it was us. We gave it all that meaning. And that's why we walked away so united and so powerful. And la naturaleza, where are we going to go? That is nature. We carry all those elements in us when we talk about the environment, the water, the fire, all of the, you know, chemicals that we are, minerals, vitamins, everything. But I would just leave it at that, is that I see the sacred in this movement, and that sacred is us, and it is nuestra madre tierra, and how we respect her, how we respond to her, and how do we teach that forward. And I'll stop there.
Well, I think that it has actually opened that opportunity. The fact that it is kind of the first refuge, I think, west of the Mississippi that's being built from the ground up. And I think it is the first environmental and economic justice strategic plan. So I think it's the legacy of the community itself. And then also maybe having someone in a leadership position that's not afraid to at least listen and you know, so that we can move forward. Because I think, you know, it's always going to be struggle no matter what, and we're working with a government entity, so that's just a reality that governs stuff. But I think there's an opening here, and it's up to us as community to keep pushing that and pushing, and that's been our lives, and that's what we need to continue to do, and do it in a good way with good intention.
Thank you. And Richard?
You know, I'm still kind of reflecting on Magdalena's comments and then Sofia's comments. You know, this is not a game we're playing here. I just want to, you know, I just kind of have to say that And so a lot of times, you know, you put a lot of work into good work into developing documents and strategic plans and making this intersections between economic and environmental justice. And then it becomes just a kind of a piece of paper, you know what I mean? Maybe in some cases an historical document. I mean, I think the strategic plan of the refuge at some point will also become an historical document. But based upon that, then we're going to have to consistently challenge each other because not only because we redefined environmentalism and conservationism, but we need to pull that intersection together to make sure that we're being responsible and accountable to each other, and that we live up to the principles that we've been talking about, and other principles that came later out of the First People of Color Summit. So I feel extremely positive about that. I mean, I think issues have been identified in this process. Gentrification, for example, the potential for gentrification, and we need to work just as hard within those documents to make some assurance of how the people and the statistics of the people that we're using that host the refuge itself, but those people and statistics are locked in to the Mountain View community as a host community, so that we don't see then some of the elders and others with homes that have been left to them and so on being displaced. You know, so I feel very, very positive about the work. I know at the end of the day that struggle don't come easy, because we've been in too many years of struggle, and way before even those of us now, the hundreds of years of struggle we're talking about. So we should never forget whose land we are sitting on at the refuge, and then we should never forget those that live in the community and communities in the South Valley that we're talking about. So everyone's going to have to struggle hard. It's not going to just be us, because when we look at these issues, as I said, systemic racism, we're going to have to dig very, very, very deep to make some assurances about how we move forward, the practices that are implemented as we move forward, and so on.
Thank you all so much for your time and your energy today in remembering and celebrating and building on this past 30 years that started much before that 30 years. But there was a really unique moment that happened there in 1991 that is still carrying an incredible amount of energy and direction for today and for the environmental justice movement. So thank you, Magdalena, Sofia, Richard. Also a big thank you to Teresa, who works with the refuge there, Teresa Skiba, who is our tech person and host and helping make this come true, as well as everyone else who helped make this possible for today's event. So thank you. Unless there's any last words, I feel like we're good to come to a close.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Sophia, Richard, and just, it's an honor to still walk with you guys. So it's been awesome. And then our newer generation, younger generation, it's a very special moment right now. Thank you.
It is. Thank you.